Well, good afternoon, Wavy.com and Wavy Facebook page. I am Jason Marks here in the studio. We're talking the patients versus Perwaiz on this gorgeous Friday, and hopefully it's going to be a gorgeous weekend, as Casey LaHecka just told us over on Wavy.com. Now, before we get to looking at Chapter 6, let me bring in the rest of the team here and show you who does the magic behind the scenes. And we're talking about executive producer Adrienne Mayfield. And there you see photojournalist Kevin Romm, who has been editing all of these pieces, the 12-minute pieces. And hi guys, how you guys doing?
Good, it's beautiful. I wish I was outside.
Doing good.
Yeah, so obviously we're now in through.
Wish it was warmer though.
We're through 5 chapters of Perwaiz versus the patients versus Perwaiz. Chapter 6 we're working on right now, and we're here on the Facebook page and also on Wavy.com talking about this chapter, the latest chapter, Chapter 5. Before we start talking about it, let's go ahead, if we can, and roll a clip from what you'll see if you go to Wavy.com, the page right now from Chapter 5.
What did you feel when he said you had cancer?
I was scared, I cried, I was nervous, and I was mortified. It was a scary situation for me.
Who were you and how long were you a patient of Dr. Perwaiz's?
My name is Tabitha Johnson, and I was a patient for approximately 7 years with Dr. Perwaiz. Most of my family used him as a physician, and so I just, felt more comfortable with him because my family was going to him for years.
So that is part of Chapter 5. You just saw Tabitha there. She was on the Dr. Oz show, and I think they taped that last March, and then obviously we all were impacted by COVID, and that's when we talked to her a little bit after that. Guys, we got into Chapter 5, and this is where we're starting to get into the surgeries. And these are the really invasive surgeries, and this is where really the heartbreaking story comes about, Adrienne, because now we're starting to hear about the hysterectomies and surgeries that women never even consented to.
Yeah, Jason, these are really moving stories. We talked with several women who say that they had surgeries they believed were unnecessary, but in Chapter 5, you're going to hear from a few women who didn't even know what type of procedure they were going to have before they had it. I don't want to give too much away because I want you to go watch it, but Tabitha Johnson and Dana Chesum didn't find out until later that they had had vital reproductive organs removed without consent. And when you think about your body and you think about bodily autonomy and a doctor performing a surgery on you and you not having consent, these were life-changing surgeries. There's no way to go back or to fix what happened to them, right, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about, for a second, let's talk about Tabitha. And Tabitha had an interesting story because she has several surgeries, young woman, right? I mean, and bubbly personality. And she's got all of these surgeries, one after another, and she thought she had cancer because Dr. Perwaiz said, hey, we're going to go ahead and remove cancerous cells, and it turns out he ended up removing most of her cervix. I mean, that's just crazy to think about.
Well, it was also really sad because of the way that she found out about it. She didn't find out right after she had the surgery. She had what's called a LEAP procedure. And so the way it was explained to her was that Dr. Perwaiz was going to go in there, essentially take out the cancerous cells from her cervix. And he told her after the surgery, you had cancer. And she thought that that procedure was, a life-saving treatment. But several years later, she had several miscarriages. She was trying to have another baby, and she had several miscarriages. And she goes to another OB-GYN, and they said, hey, Tabitha, you're actually high risk because you only have half of the cervix. And that's how she found out. Can you imagine? Jason, you just had your second child. Imagine the heartbreak for a parent.
Yeah, to hear some of these women who were really young, I mean, we interviewed women who ranged in all ages, but some of the women we spoke with were in their 30s.
Yeah, and when this happened, Tabitha was 24, actually.
Right, and so, I mean, you hear about the cases where a woman is in her early 20s or even up to 30, and they're getting hysterectomies. And not only, when we talk about a hysterectomy, for those who don't know, because I didn't know before we started working on this project, I didn't realize all that entails not only getting the organs taken out, but when you are still when you're premenopausal, you're talking about a lot of hormonal issues when it comes to getting a hysterectomy. And doctors will tell you that if a woman who is premenopausal gets a hysterectomy, it could make her go crazy simply because of the issues with the hormones. And I didn't realize that, Kevin. I mean, you're a guy, and before, I know when we first started working on this, we didn't know a lot of the terms or the impact that these procedures were having on women. And to me, it blows my mind to think about just the simple impacts, the sheer impacts that were left behind.
Yeah, and the first person that I think of who kind of shed that light to me was when we were interviewing Robin Serta. We highlighted her a few chapters ago, and the way she described it, it wasn't with the hormones, it wasn't a gradual, I guess, loss of hormones or feelings. It's immediately once you wake up from the procedure, is how she put it. And even Shannon Cohen, who we did mention in this in Chapter 5, that was part of the reason why she was hesitating on getting the procedure, and that's what she was trying to tell Dr. Perwaiz, is that, you know, I don't want to be taking all these hormones for the rest of my life, especially if I don't feel like I have to do it. And her story is particularly interesting to me in this past chapter, just because, you know, just like she had the right to, she told Dr. Perwaiz, you know, I'm not so sure that I need this, Dr. Perwaiz, and how persistent he was in calling her and bringing it up every single time she went to see him after that. It was, I mean, definitely alarming.
And Shannon's an interesting one because, like many of the patients we talk with, it's generational. Her mom went there, her sister went there, she went there. Perwaiz was like a family friend, essentially. And when you look at it, she decides not to have this procedure. 2 days before she's supposed to go into the OR, she decides, I'm not going to do she's been going back and forth about this in her mind. I'm not going to do the hysterectomy. It's not right. I'm only 40. I'm not going to do it. And what does he do? He calls her at home, and then the same tone, that grandfatherly tone that she knew all these years, was much different, because now it was a guy who was pushing, and how dare you question what I'm saying, and you need to get this surgery.
Yeah, I actually talked to Shannon yesterday on the phone, and you know, she's been following along with the series. We're very grateful to have been able to elevate her voice as a patient, and she told me how grateful she is that she listened to her gut, because she didn't think she needed the hysterectomy. She decided, as you just mentioned, to cancel it 2 days before she was supposed to have it. And a few years later, I mean, she's fine. You know, she's fine right now. She hasn't had a hysterectomy. She hasn't had further health problems. So she feels very grateful to have listened to her gut, and she empathizes so much with the other patients whose stories she's hearing for the very first time. Because as we've mentioned before in these Facebook Lives, one thing that I think struck all of us was the pattern, right, Jason and Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, if you're just joining us, by the way, we're on Wavy Facebook. We're also on wavy.com. talking about the Patients First Perwaiz. This is a project that we spent more than a year dealing with, looking at Dr. Perwaiz, and also looking at the impact that he had, and trying to figure out if there were red flags along the way. And we're starting to get some comments coming in onto the page right now. Yolanda just wrote in, he did my last 2 surgeries, and now I have several medical issues. We've heard that before, that the surgeries caused many more pain. You know, I think we did that a couple of chapters ago where we talked to, was it Robin?
It was
Robin's,
Linda.
Linda, who still deals with the pain even today, and we've heard that. Christina said, I've had a terrible experience with him as well. Lauren Pace wrote in, and she said, I had an awful experience with him as well. I was only 19, and he performed 3 surgeries on me as well. I trusted him because my family went to him. And coming up in Chapter 6, when we get there, guys, in a couple minutes, we're going to talk about surgeries on teenagers, and that is going to be a focus, one of the focal points of our next chapter. We talk about the consent, right? And part of this chapter, Chapter 5, is not only the hysterectomies, but it's also talking about the surgeries that were done without consent. And there's plenty of evidence in that throughout this chapter.
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. I mean, the feedback I've heard from female friends who have watched this is that they're absolutely blown away by the fact that they didn't give consent to Dr. Perwaiz for the surgeries, because you think about your body, as I mentioned earlier, bodily autonomy, and you think about you don't want people touching you, you don't want people doing things to you without you giving permission. I think the most egregious example of that we found was actually a woman we featured in this chapter named Dana, who testified against Dr. Perwaiz. She went to him, it was her very first appointment with him, and he said, you need to have your ovaries removed immediately. 2 days later, she's in for a surgery, and when she wakes up, he didn't do what he said he was gonna do. He actually gave her a hysterectomy.
Yeah.
Jason, didn't he forge her medical records to justify that?
I don't remember that part, but I think that the interesting thing and the heartbreaking thing about Dana, let's just set this up for our viewers here on Facebook and wavy.com. So Dana, as you mentioned, goes to him, has that first appointment. You need to get your ovaries out. Goes under the knife, wakes up thinking that she's had her 2 ovaries out, finds out that only 1 ovary was taken out and the uterus was missing, right?
Yeah.
Zip ahead 5 years, and that's when she finds out that her sister has got stage 4 ovarian cancer. And she says, the sister says to Dana, you need to go get checked, because, you know, I don't want you ending up with the same thing that I have, right? All right, well, let's catch it if you do have it in time. Dana goes to get checked, and that's when the OB-GYN tells Dana, by the way, you have both your ovaries, but your uterus is gone. And so imagine Dana, and she testified, as you mentioned, in the federal trial, and you know, she told the jury during the trial how heartbreaking this is, that she, in her mind, thought that she didn't have ovaries, and so she wasn't going to get yearly exams looking for possible ovarian cancer. And all this time, she could have been sitting essentially on a time bomb. And Kevin, to me, that's the most heartbreaking thing when you think about, when you start looking at the totality of what happened to these patients.
Yeah, and it just goes back to the same things we kept hearing over and over again. Just like with Tabitha, she initially thought it was just cancerous cells that he was taking out, and then little did she know, somebody else along the line, when she got that second opinion, had to go back and tell her, actually, no, that's not what happened. I mean, it's the same thing we're seeing here with Dana. I mean, you trust your doctor and that they performed what they said that they were going to perform. You wake up, you assume that it is still true, and then 5 years down the line, and you're like, I mean, she's like, what the heck? Like, what happened? I mean, I thought that I was told explicitly this is what happened to me, yet now I'm finding out something very, very different.
Sure, yeah, I mean, absolutely. Ashley McDilda just wrote in. She said, I heard from several women who were grateful that they left his practice, and they're thankful to the woman and the nurses who have spoken out. We're obviously grateful for the women that we spoke with, the patients who were brave to step up and speak with us, and also the nurses. Ashley was one of those nurses, former nurse over at Chesapeake Regional, and dealt with Dr. Perwaiz quite a lot, and she was one of those who you'll see coming up here in the future chapters, talking about how she tried to go to her supervisors, and ultimately nothing ever happened. Consent was a big issue. Obviously, when you look at the invasive procedures and the invasive surgeries, Dr. Perwaiz did a lot of them, Adrienne. I mean, well, his patients were 5 times had a 5 times amount of chance, greater chances, I should say, to get some sort of surgery than other OB-GYNs, which is really alarming.
Yeah, it really is. And I think there's 2 different types of consent that you have to really consider here. You have to consider consent, like in Dana Chisholm's case, where there was no opportunity to give it, right? Because he didn't tell her he was going to give her a hysterectomy. And then you have to think about informed consent. And that's Tabitha Johnson's case. He said he was going to perform a LEAP procedure. He explained to her that he was going to remove cancerous cells from her cervix, but he didn't explain to her that he was going to be removing half of her cervix. So
right.
That's kind of the issue there. It's like, if I sign a piece of paper based on understanding what my doctor has explained to me, I have to have my doctor explain it to me in a way that makes sense and that's accurate and truthful. And with Dana Chisholm's records, as I mentioned earlier, he actually put in symptoms that she didn't have, and he put in complaints she didn't have, and he said she asked for the hysterectomy. And so not only was there not consent, but there was this fraudulent thing to try and get it passed through insurance, and that's what people like Ashley talked about.
Yeah.
You know?
I will tell you, there were those themes that were reiterated all through his 5-week trial, where prosecutors would say that he used boilerplate language, meaning that he would use the same sort of diagnoses, you know, the protrusion or the lower back pain or pelvic pain, and those were always the diagnoses that he would send over to the hospital to justify the surgery. And many times he would also say the patient was requesting a hysterectomy, or, you know, no one was requesting to have a hysterectomy. He was saying, we need to do a hysterectomy, and you know, the women were doing what their doctor was saying. Tamika said here that she had more than 10 surgeries. Cheryl just wrote in and she said, can you share any information about any lawsuits against Dr. Perwaiz and how to obtain our medical records? So let me take the first part of that. Yes, there have been, and we will cover this at some point towards the latter half of the series. There now have been, I believe, Adrienne, it seems like 8-ish civil lawsuits that have been filed individually from patients against Dr. Perwaiz, and also filed against Chesapeake Regional, and those are in Chesapeake Court. And then there's a couple of, I think there's one in Portsmouth, and then I believe there was one that was filed in Norfolk. So you're starting to see the civil lawsuits start to come out against Dr. Perwaiz, which isn't, that's not shocking. I know that there are a lot of attorneys who have a lot of clients who are now just starting to file these civil lawsuits for their clients. As far as medical records go, the FBI still has a lot of the medical records, but they have medical records that only go back 5 years. When they raided his office, they only took 3,000 medical records. So they still have the majority or most of those. If you go to the Patients First Perwaiz, which is on wavy.com, you look for the page, there is a link, Adrienne, right, that will take you to that information to get your medical records back.
We've got that information linked in several pieces of our coverage, Jason. I believe it's in chapters 1 through 5 right now, towards the bottom of the page. The FBI has set up a website essentially for sharing information about the case. There you can find an email address where you can request medical records or help finding your medical records. I just want to acknowledge a couple of these comments that we're getting because they're really heartbreaking. Cheryl said that she had kidney failure after her hysterectomy. Tamika said that she had a hysterectomy because she was tired of Perwaiz cutting on her, but she still had a few surgeries after that. Kathy says the last surgery he performed on her wrecked her, and Evelyn said that he messed up her daughter for life. And we just want to acknowledge the long-lasting pain that, you know, his crimes have left on the community,
Sure.
Whether that's physical pain or just simply a lack of trust, because that's something we've heard a lot. Shannon, when we talked yesterday, I mean, this was her family OB-GYN. He delivered both of her sisters, and the trust factor is huge. And I think that's why federal prosecutors are accepting patient and victim impact statements from anybody who was impacted by Perwaiz's crimes.
Sure.
Kevin, you know a little bit about that. Jason, you do too?
Yeah. Before we get to Kevin and we start going into chapter 6, because I want Kevin to touch upon chapter 6, because that's what he's starting to work on. Let's just give a couple of new pieces of information real fast. The trial obviously happened and ended in November. He was scheduled to be sentenced March 31st, and he was looking at 465 years in prison. Well, that's not going to happen now. It's not going to happen on March 31st. There is a conflict with one of the defense attorneys. She's got a trial that same day, and because of COVID and the way the courts are doing things, the state courts along with the federal courts, they're not doing many trials, and so when you're scheduled for a trial, there's no way to get out of it. Really, these trials need to start going on. We have obviously a lot of suspects who are waiting to be adjudicated, and so when you have a trial that's set, you have to go. The trial has now been pushed back, or I should say the sentencing. There's not been a date yet. The judge just accepted that, and there's not been a date for this. So we know that's going to happen, that eventually it's somewhere along the way, maybe it's 6 weeks, maybe it's another month. that's when the sentencing will happen. So it won't happen March 31st. Another thing that we learned since we were last with you Friday, in December, the FBI started to realize that there was a need for these patients, for all the patients, maybe to have some therapy, because as you can imagine, these women not only were potentially harmed physically, but also emotionally. And so what has happened here is there's been a collaboration of therapists in the area who have now set up a website, and they're also now asking for women who need some sort of therapy, who want to talk to someone, who want to maybe get involved in a counseling group with other Perwaiz patients. That's going to be available. We have that link for you on wavy.com. I think Adrienne just put that story up yesterday. So there's a link to that of all the information that you would need if you're a patient and you feel like you are someone who might need to talk to someone, or who might want to talk to other Perwaiz patients. There is that opportunity now, and that is just up and running, and that was just within the last 2 weeks that got up and running. One other thing, if you are a Perwaiz patient, and we can reiterate this again, if you're a Perwaiz patient and you want to write a victim impact statement because maybe you want to go to court during his sentencing and tell him, look him in the eyes and tell him how you feel, how he impacted your life, you have that opportunity. All of that information is on the Patients First Perwaiz page. There are links to all of that. All right, let's get to Chapter 6. Why do we talk about the invasive surgeries? And now we're going to talk about the procedures, the diagnostic procedures. And Kevin, why do we do that? Why do we talk about diagnostic procedures when it comes to surgeries?
Well, in this next chapter, we highlight first off Taylor Burritt, who is the daughter of Pam Burritt, who we, I think, highlighted in Chapter 2. And Pam was, I guess, she was highlighted because she, and as well as Taylor, I mean, they looked at Dr. Perwaiz as a family friend. I mean, Taylor even mentions it. I mean, she would text him if she needed anything. And what she says is, I mean, he never let her down. And so we follow her as she gets a second opinion. And I'm not going to give away all of the details, but I guess she comes away from that having some different thoughts about Dr. Perwaiz, because there were a few of those procedures that he performed on her. And at the time, of course, she trusted him and didn't think anything negatively of what he was doing to her. That wasn't even really a possibility to think about until he was arrested. And so once he was arrested, she was like, I mean, a lot of other patients thinking, maybe I should go get a second opinion. And we follow her, and what we find out is pretty interesting. What she has to say is pretty interesting as well.
And it's really, this next chapter, Adrienne, focuses not only Taylor, but it's about the procedures, the hysteroscopies and the colposcopies. And those are key because, as we've learned, those set the ground floor essentially for the hysterectomies.
Yeah, Jason, we learned that Dr. Perwaiz did these diagnostic procedures. He was an outlier. He did them a lot more than his peers. And these laid the foundation for more invasive surgeries and procedures. And I don't want to give it all away. It's kind of complicated, but I think in writing the story, you've done an excellent job making it understandable. It's kind of like building blocks, right? You lay a foundation, you build the house, and eventually a lot of these women were escalated to hysterectomies. The twist is, though, he wasn't doing these diagnostic procedures correctly, and you're gonna tell us about that in Chapter 6.
Yeah, there's a lot of money that he made from these procedures, and that was just part of what the FBI said his scheme was. He did these procedures, he made a lot of money, and what the thing is, these diagnostic procedures, he used these bogus findings to justify one surgery to the next, and that's why these are important, and that's what you're going to see in Chapter 6. Adrienne, you with us next week, or is next week the week you're off?
Next week's the week I'm off. I'm turning 31, so.
31, Jesus,
yeah.
Whoa.
Real
Man,
quick.
you are old.
Well, yeah, real quick, I just wanted to give a refresh to everybody about how to navigate wavy.com just to find the Patients First Perwaiz. If you go to wavy.com, there's several different ways you can find us. We have a banner on our homepage, or under our homepage news tab. You can click on that and you're going to see the Patients First Perwaiz. It's going to take you to the project homepage. There, you're going to be able to find a glossary, because none of us are doctors, so you'll be able to understand some of these medical terms we're talking about. You're going to hear patient diaries where the women tell their stories in their own words, and you're going to find links to all of the chapters. And Jason and Kevin, I cannot believe that we are halfway through launch with this project.
Well, we know that the sentencing is delayed, so we still have some time, right? Well, Adrienne, we'll miss you next week. Kevin and I will be back here to talk about the Patients vs. Perwaiz, Chapter 6. We'll be back here 1:15 on Friday. And of course, the page is up and running with all of those helpful things if you're a patient of his or if you just want to see the story. We appreciate everyone tuning in to the Facebook Live and clicking on the stories that we've done so far. Obviously, we put a lot of work to it and we're proud of the work, but we also have to remember the women who are still dealing with these issues and who are brave enough to talk with us, including the nurses. So we'll send it. We'll call it a day here. We really appreciate everyone tuning in. We'll see you back here on Facebook and on wavy.com next Friday at 1:15.